PRS guitars. If you've ever tried one or if you've ever watched a YouTube video on one, you already know what I'm probably going to say. It's a fantastic guitar. It's great. Nearly perfect. And that's both the company's greatest gift and their greatest curse. PRS guitars suffers from what I call the Phelps effect. Let me explain. Michael Phelps is one of the most decorated Olympians of all time. 23 gold medals, 3 silvers, 2 bronzes. He holds multiple world records and he dominated nearly every event he entered across 4 Olympic Games. But after a while, people just stopped reacting. See, there was no drama, no underdog story. In fact, when I was growing up, I remember there was this big news campaign where he was talking about being bullied for having big ears and how that was his biggest challenge to overcome. Now, I'm not trying to undermine the pain and suffering that comes from bullying. It can be very traumatic for children and adults alike. But the simple fact is, when it came to swimming and the Olympics, Michael Phelps was unmatched. His perfection became so normal that he kind of became invisible. And I think that's happening with PRS. When a guitar solves all the problems we're used to fighting, when there are no clear and obvious flaws, when it can give us enough tones to replace 2 or even 3 guitars, well, that guitar can sometimes disappear. Because perfection without problems rarely registers. That type of story just doesn't stick in the minds of humans. And this really starts to click when we think about the 2 most iconic guitar brands that shaped everything, Gibson and Fender. So let's start with Gibson, or at least a Gibson-style Les Paul guitar. Thick tone, endless sustain, decades of legacy. But it's also kind of heavy, not exactly ergonomic. Upper fret access can be tight. But still, we love the Les Paul. Not just for its sound, but also for the story. There's romance in the flaws. So we keep the soul, but we smooth the scars. So we thin out the neck, we thin out the body, give some comfort cuts and weight relief, throw on a Perform Axe for ergonomics, and if you're a tremolo guy like me, we can add one of those too. The Les Paul lives on, modernized but still mythic. Then there's Fender and the Stratocaster. Bright, expressive, and snappy. I mean, I grew up playing Strats. They were my first style of guitar. But the bridge pickup can be a bit thin, the control layout can feel a bit cramped, and the vintage tremolo can be a bit temperamental. So we get custom voiced noiseless pickups. Some guys put a humbucker in the bridge, and we go to a 2-point trem, or in this case, a very beautiful Rick Tune tremolo. And with that, the Super Strat is born. But then there's PRS. This company didn't even show up until the mid-1980s. We're talking about decades after Fender and Gibson already wrote the rulebook. But by 1987, the Custom 24 was complete and Paul Reed Smith had done something bold. He took the corks out. He combined the warmth of a Les Paul with the snap of a Strat and built a guitar that quietly solved the problems most players had simply learned to live with. But see, now there's no vintage obsession or tortured legacy. There's no mythical 1950s or 60s whatever to search for, and there's no flaws to defend in forums. And I know it's strange, but I'll just say it again, that's both a gift and a curse. I mean, PRS guitars are so good and so consistent, people actually call them boring. Not because they're flawed, but because they're flawless. That's the Phelps effect. So I'm going to break down what I think contributes to this and what makes PRS stand out in an honestly crowded guitar world. I was able to borrow a bunch of PRS guitars for research purposes. So I don't get to keep these instruments, but my goal is to show you what makes them unique. And of course, no company is perfect, so I'll also point out where I think PRS needs to improve. So I like to usually start my guitar discussions at the headstock, but today we're actually going to start with the pickups, and that's because these guitars have endless tones that I'll be showing you throughout the video. PRS has really carved out a niche for themselves with their humbucker pickups. They're versatile and very well balanced, and honestly, they sound incredible. I like them so much, in fact, that I had my really beautiful and expensive Abasi Concepts ME guitar. I had it routed out for PRS pickups because I just love how they sound. I would say that compared to a traditional Gibson humbucker, the PRS pickups are a bit brighter and they're not as dark or compressed. And I honestly like the sound of both Gibson and PRS pickups, but if you want a bit more clarity in the mids and top end, PRS is going to give that to you. And here's something that you might not expect. A lot of people think that PRS is a brand that's probably for like rock guys, blues guys, maybe some jazz guys, kind of the versatile guitar player. But everyone who I have ever met who has tried the Mark Tremonti Bridge pickup has said that it's the best metal pickup they've ever tried, or at least in the top end of metal pickups. So PRS definitely has a gift with working with all types of different sounds here. Now I will say this, if you're someone chasing the perfect vintage single coil tones, like the exact feel of a 70s Strat or the bite of an overwound bridge Tele pickup, PRS might not be your brand. They of course do make single coils, but that's not really their specialty. What they do specialize in is more of the hum canceling versatility kind of a thing. So in addition to full-size humbuckers, PRS also make these narrow fill pickups that kind of sound like a slightly fatter but still hum canceling version of a P90. But when I say versatility, I don't just mean that PRS has different types of humbuckers. Their guitars also usually include coil tapping or coil splitting through a 5-way switch or some type of push-pull configuration. Actually, some guitars even use both, but a quick side tangent here because we often interchangeably use the terms coil split and coil tap, but they're not the exact same thing, and we can really learn more about that with PRS. Splitting a coil isolates one coil from the humbucker and gives you a basic single coil sound. Now, if a pickup was specifically designed to be coil split, it can sound fantastic. But if a humbucker was not made with that in mind, it can sound pretty weak and anemic. By contrast, tapping a coil gives you access to part of the winding, which gives you more scope for sculpting a single coil tone if you know what you're doing. And PRS kind of specializes in going between those two things and figuring out which is going to be the right for what pickup and what guitar. And the results are some of the most convincing single coil tones you'll find in a humbucker-based instrument. Again, it's not a vintage Strat, it's not a vintage Tele, but for a lot of players who just want a really good, convincing, versatile tone, it works. But here's the thing. It's not just the pickups that have this high attention to detail, it even goes back to the headstock. The PRS headstock, it's compact, it's elegant, and it solves a lot of problems that are found on some of those older iconic brands. So if you think about the Gibson Les Paul, it of course has a gorgeous and historic headstock. But the string angles between the nut and the tuners can cause tuning instability. Someone like Mike Adams can cut the nut perfectly to fix that. He kind of angles it a specific way which decreases the angle, but Gibson won't do that for you out of the factory. Then there's the design of the tilt-back headstock on the Gibson. It's visually striking, but it's also famously prone to breaking. In fact, I once bought an Epiphone guitar, not a Gibson, but same design. It was brand new, it came shipped in a hard shell case and it was packaged very well from the factory, but when I opened up the case, the headstock was already broken off. And now you take the Fender headstock. It avoids the breakage problem, and we have straight string pull from the nut to the tuners, which is fantastic. But without string trees, you may not have enough downward pressure on the nut, especially for the high strings. So PRS combines the best of both of these designs. You get the straight string pull from the nut to the tuners, which helps with tuning stability, especially with the tremolo, which we'll talk about later. But you also get just enough break angle to keep everything seated in the nut properly without needing to use string trees. And as you can see, PRS does have a slight tilt back on the headstock, but not nearly enough to worry about breaking. And honestly, I just think it looks pretty cool. It's a bit compact, a little bit asymmetrical, and it just works. And when we move from the headstock to the nut and the tuners, you start to see something that PRS does that kind of defines their entire brand. They go above and beyond and kind of overthink things even when they don't have to. Let me explain. So whether it's a big manufacturer or a small boutique builder, most people just buy certain parts off the shelf because they're inexpensive and they work perfect already. So for example, an expensive Gibson uses a Graphtec nut. A cheap Epiphone uses a Graphtec nut. If you get a custom-made guitar by a luthier who's going to charge you $20,000, is going to have a Graphtec nut, most likely. It's probably also usually going to have standard Godot tuners because these things just work really well already and they're inexpensive. So Gibson, Ibanez, your favorite luthier online, they all just buy them and use them in their guitars. It's simple. But PRS doesn't do that. They make their own tuners and they also make their own nuts. And these tuners and nuts work really well. But again, they don't work any differently or better than any other tuners or nuts, so it makes you wonder why go through the hassle of doing this. Maybe PRS believes their design is better, maybe it actually saves them money long term, or maybe it's just about having total control over the aesthetic and the brand. Either way, it kind of says something about the company when they do something like this, since literally no one else does this. But now let's talk about neck carves, because in my opinion, most necks are boring. I've said this in other videos and some people weren't quite sure what I meant, so let me explain. Most guitar companies offer 1 or 2 standard neck shapes, and in my experience, the vast majority fall into a version of a modern C, a standard C, or just a C. And it makes a lot of sense because the C shape, especially the modern or the medium C, it's the perfect comfortable, C for comfortable, it's the perfect middle ground for most players. It's safe, and if you're going to mass produce hundreds of thousands of guitars, you might as well go with the safe choice. But I'll just say it again, for me, it's kind of boring. The neck is the part of the guitar we're going to interact with the most, and if you're lucky enough to own multiple guitars, which a lot of us do as guitar players, it's fun if they all don't feel exactly the same. Now, of course, some companies offer standout shapes, like the Ibanez Wizard neck, which is famously thin, or the ESP Thin U, which is famously thin and U-shaped. But outside of those signature shapes, most of what's left is just back to a C. So at best, most brands give you one signature shape, maybe 2 or 3 other options in their high-end models. But PRS flips that completely. So they have the pattern thin, which for me feels pretty close to what most companies would call a modern C. But when you go deeper into the lineup, things start to get really interesting. There's pattern thin, pattern regular, pattern vintage. Then you've got the artist-specific shapes like the DGT, which has a legendarily unique feel that a lot of players really love. And then there's a guitar like the Miles Kennedy signature model, and that has the thickest, chunkiest neck I've ever played in my entire life. Even though I love big necks, I would never make that guitar my main guitar. The neck is just too big. And I bet a lot of other players feel the same exact way, but it's cool that it exists. And if you're someone who likes a giant neck in your arsenal, you have that option. And of course, if you don't care about any of this, you can just get a PRS guitar with a pattern regular or a pattern thin neck and you'll feel right at home. But the really awesome thing is that they don't reserve these shapes for only their highest end core models. You find this variation even in the SE line. But now let's talk about something a bit more polarizing, the bird inlays. In a world full of solid dots, offset dots, empty dots, and occasionally offset empty dots, the PRS bird inlays can feel flashy, especially the very ornate ones. And to be honest, when I was younger, I kind of felt the same way. In fact, when I was growing up in the early 2000s, I lumped PRS in with what I would call the emo era Schecter aesthetic. And you know it as soon as you've seen it. It's back when every band used an orange or a Line 6 amp, tight jeans, bangs, and they all played Schecter guitars that were covered in abalone. Back then, I was new to guitar and I didn't understand what made PRS special. I just saw the ornate birds. But now the birds have honestly grown on me. On some models like the S2 Studio, the birds are clean and subtle, just a soft cream color. On more expensive models like the standard 24 satin, they go full ornate. On a few models, PRS also has the moon inlays, which I really love, as do a lot of other players. And every once in a while, they offer something that's totally different, like the Celtic knot inlays that are found on a John McLaughlin's short run guitar. That's not my aesthetic. I don't like those. But I do really love the new dragon inlays on the Herman Lee Signature model. By the way, let's have a little fun. How about in the comments below, I want you to rate these 4 style of PRS inlays. So we have the classic birds, the moons, the Celtic knots, and the dragons. For me personally, it goes number 1 is the dragon inlays. Number 2 is probably tied the moons and the birds, but the moon might get a slight edge, and the John McLaughlin Celtic knots, those are at the bottom of my personal list. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Give me your ranking. And while you're there, definitely check out the first link in the description for something special just for you. But apart from the bird inlays and the pickups, another thing that PRS is very much known for is their quality control. Their fit and finish, especially their fretwork on even their SE line, is consistently flawless. Now, luckily, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of other companies have really stepped up their quality control. Especially in the last 5 years, we've been getting a lot of inexpensive guitars that have really great quality control. But PRS has really been a pioneer in this realm, in my opinion. Now, one critique I do have of PRS guitars is that as of making this video, at least to my knowledge, there are no primary models that have stainless steel frets. And to me, that's a pretty big oversight. When you sell beautiful guitars that are $3,000, $5,000, $10,000, and there's no stainless steel option in 2025 and beyond, that to me just feels inconsistent with the rest of the guitar world. So I would love to see PRS start to introduce this feature at some point soon. Also, I really think it would be cool if PRS made a headless guitar, but that's just me. Let me know if you like that idea as well in the comments below. And then when it comes to the bodies, we basically have a variation of a single cut like on this Mark Tremonti Signature model. And then we have variations of the double cut. This is kind of the standard 24 type vibe. I honestly like them both. I like this shape more, but I actually like the pickup selector switch on this one more. So that means the McCarty double cut would probably be my preferred style of body, along with pickup configuration, pickup switch, and tone and volume knobs. But yeah, the PRS body, we of course have a neck through design, we have some sculpting on the back, we have a nice forearm bevel, sometimes a violin carve, and it's just a traditional feeling yet still comfortable guitar. We also usually have some carving on the upper horn, which is great for high fret access. That combined with the, well, let's talk a little bit about the heel joint because, well, it's very unique on PRS guitars. It's kind of bulky. It's a lot larger than a lot of other modern heel joints. Because of the way that it's set into the body, this actually doesn't get in the way because you only have to put your thumb right there in order to reach every single fret comfortably. But it does at least look very different when compared to other guitars, especially the more sculpted ones we see nowadays. But as a quick comparison, this is a Kiesel guitar, lovely guitar, and the heel is much more sculpted, and we see this a lot more on modern guitars. PRS doesn't really tend to do things like that. Now, if memory serves me correctly, I believe there is an interview somewhere with Paul Reed Smith explaining that this style of extra meat on the bone as it connects to the body, I believe Paul Reed Smith said that this helps with more sustain and resonance for the overall guitar. Now, to be completely honest, do I know if that's true or not? I definitely don't. Would I guess that's true? Probably not. However, Paul Reed Smith knows a lot more about building guitars than I do. And even if it's not correct, the fact that at least it was done with intention, well, to me, that goes back to the whole idea of what PRS usually does. They usually overthink and over-engineer things, which again, if you can go either over-engineered or under-engineered, it's clear which one you would want. Now, similar to the ornate birds, PRS is of course very much known for their very fancy flame tops. This is a core model, so it does have a very nice flame, but if you get a 10 top, it gets a lot crazier. And similar to the PRS bird inlays, when I was growing up, I didn't really like the idea of a flamey top. To be honest, I couldn't afford one anyway, so it didn't really matter. In fact, when I bought my first PRS guitar, it was the DGT SE a couple years ago, and I specifically went with the gold top and the moon inlays because some of my younger self was still kind of peeking through my older age, and I didn't like the idea of birds and flames, although again, I kind of like it now. So if you're like me from a few years ago, you can get the Satin 24, which has a plain top, or like the DGT with a plain top. But if you want to go full crazy flame, they will definitely give that to you. And on top of that, you can even get a very flamey top on the SE guitars. Now, of course, that's not going to be a full maple cap. It's just going to be a veneer. So if you're a tone wood snob, that might bother you. But if you're in it just for the aesthetics, it definitely passes bar. And that brings us to the PRS 6-screw tremolo. And I have a lot of history with the idea of 6-screw tremolos, and my opinions on them. PRS totally changed that for me. Let me explain. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but growing up, I played Strats. My first Strat was the cheapest Squire at Guitar Center at the time. It was like $100, just black and white. Loved it. A few years later, I saved up my money and bought a Mexican Strat from eBay, and that became my main guitar for a while. And both of these guitars had that old school Squire 6-screw tremolo. It was really, really bad. It was stiff. It was hard to adjust. It was barely usable. And then toward the end of high school, I bought my first Parker guitar. It was a Parker P38, fairly inexpensive compared to the Parker Fly, of course. But that guitar had a Wilkinson 2-point tremolo, and that completely changed me and the way that I play guitar. I became a tremolo fanatic. And because of this history, I always associated the idea of a 2-point tremolo with smooth and silky operation, and the idea of a 6-screw tremolo with being hard to adjust and not very nice. But when I got my first PRS guitar, again, the DGT SE, it has a 6-screw tremolo that feels extremely silky smooth. And by the way, the pickups also had a very beautiful humbucker tone and a super convincing split coil tone. It was so convincing, I did a whole video on the topic. And I know we're talking about tremolos right now, but it just goes to show you that even the SE guitars are fantastic and they keep the same PRS quality that we all expect. But anyway, focusing on the PRS tremolo, this has to be the silkiest 6-screw tremolo I have ever tried in my life. And as I've gravitated away from the more crazy stuff like the Floyd Rose and all of the crazy acrobatics you can do, I've wanted tremolos that are set up with a slightly stiffer feel, but I still want them to be smooth and I still want to be able to pull up a bit. And that's pretty much exactly what the PRS tremolo is like. It's not as easy to manipulate as, say, Floyd Rose, but it's still incredibly stable, very, very smooth. It has like a stiff, squishy feel to it, and the tuning stability is phenomenal. So when you look at the whole PRS guitar, again, no matter what model it is, you get great tuners. a great nut that's cut well, great neck, great pickups, great QC. The body is comfortable but feels traditional. I mean, there's just nothing to really complain about. You don't really see people talking about buying any PRS guitar and then modding them. That's just not what they're here for. But again, that's the gift and that's the curse, because the guitar community, we love the idea of hunting the perfect vintage guitar. We love the idea of modding guitars and trying to find the exact pickup we want. We love to try to find fancy, new, innovative, aftermarket tremolo bridges like the Sophia Trem, but no one does that to their PRS guitars because they don't need it. And this last little part kind of confirms that whole idea. If you go over to the PRS website and you look at their artist roster, of course you'll see a few big names like John Mayer and Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin. These are super famous guitar players, of course. But if you go a little further, you're going to see a super duper long list of musicians you have absolutely never heard of. You couldn't pick them out of a lineup. These are some of the best musicians on the planet, but they are working musicians. They go on tours, they're backup artists, they're studio musicians. And to me, that kind of just says a lot about what PRS guitars are really about. If you're on tour 200 days a year, you don't have time to be worrying about getting fancy tremolo replacement bridges and modding your pickups and all of this stuff. You don't need that. You need to just have a guitar that's going to get the job done. If you're a studio musician, you want one guitar you can bring to the studio if possible that's going to give you a lot of versatile sounds. And even if you just think about what it's like to go to a live show, you usually see the famous singer-songwriter who plays guitar at the center of the stage in the front, and they usually have a Fender or a Gibson because they have some giant endorsement deal. And so they can travel with 5 or 10 or 20 guitars, all Fender or Gibson. They have a tech who will take care of them and everything's great. But the guitar player on that stage who you don't recognize, the person in the back, they usually can only travel with 1, 2, at the absolute most 3 guitars. They need to be heard, not seen. They need to be reliable, and they need to get the job done. And I think that's why they pick PRS guitars. The artists are kind of made to be invisible. I truly believe that just about every guitar company, if not every guitar model, has a hidden gift and curse that's kind of fun. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, so if there's a guitar you want to see in the series, definitely leave it in the comments below, and check out this one next.